Okay, bear with me because this one's gonna get a bit weird. I've been feeling kinda hopeless lately, and I've always found the best way to deal with that is to cut loose and do something a little unhinged. And while I'm sure you have your own, more healthy ways of unwinding, for me, that usually means an obsessively thorough deep dive into some sort of meaningless question that my brain just kinda got stuck on. So I'm gonna do that. Will it be interesting? Educational? Coherent? Who knows? Stick with me and we'll find out together as I try to figure out once and for all which chord is the absolute worst. Okay, so if we're going to do this properly, we're going to have to define two words, worst and chord. Let's start with the second one. For this video, I'm going to say that a chord is any collection of 3 notes in standard tuning with a defined root, but no particular voicing. I chose these rules mostly to keep the length of this video at least somewhat reasonable. Even with this extremely narrow definition, there's still 55 possible chords, and yes, we're going to talk about every single one. But I also wanted to keep it constrained because it lets me look for the chord with, in some abstract way, the worst essence. I can always add another note from deep in the microtonal abyss, or I can spread the notes out in weird, disorienting ways. Believe it or not, that's a major triad. But since large chords have small chords inside them, reducing down to the smallest interesting case gives us more room to play around and have some real fun with it. As for worst, the definition I'm going for here is just like vibes. Longtime viewers will know that I don't really like the idea of objective quality in art, so I'm not going to try to put numbers on this. It's all gut reactions and taste. How do I feel about these chords? Which ones are the least appealing to me personally? That leaves plenty of room for you to disagree, and there's a whole comment section down below for you to share what you think I got wrong, but in the interest of having some kind of point, I'll go through some of the main things I was looking for. The obvious place to start is dissonance. Chords that are less pleasant to listen to are worse. And as a first order approximation, it's not bad, but it's also incomplete. Dissonance can be really cool. The entire cycle of tension and release that drives traditional Western harmony relies on dissonant chords in order to accentuate the consonant ones. We need dissonance, at least for certain goals. So another thing I'll be looking for is uselessness. Can I imagine wanting to write with a chord? Do I know of genres that do? And finally, I'll be looking at general aesthetic stuff like chord structure. Do the notes fit together in a way that I, as a music theorist, find conceptually pleasing? Do I like thinking about the chord? Does it inspire anything in me? If I can find a chord that's unpleasant to listen to, unhelpful to use, and uninteresting to play around with, I'm pretty sure I'll have a winner. So with those definitions in hand, let's get some easy ones out of the way. The consonant triads consist of a perfect fifth and some kind of third, either major or minor. You know them, you love them, there's not a lot to say about them here. And I do know some experimental composers who might put these near the top of their list, but I'm a pop theorist, so I'm gonna give them a pass. They're everywhere for a reason. And we can expand that to the other basic triads. If we look at the consonant ones, we see that each pair of consecutive notes is some kind of third apart. In the major triad, it's a major third then a minor one, and in the minor triad, it's minor then major, so the logical next step is to try it with other pairs of thirds. If we put 2 minors on top of each other, we get the diminished triad, and 2 majors gives us the augmented triad. These are both a lot more dissonant because they lack that strong perfect fifth, but they make up for it in other ways. The diminished triad is useful as a driver of resolutions, and the symmetrical nature of the augmented triad makes it the center of dozens of interesting theoretical models. Check out my video about cube dance if you want more on that. Anyway, these are both good chords. Moving on. Next up on our easy eliminations, we have the 7th chords. Now, typically 7th chords have 4 notes, which breaks the rules, but we can cheat a little bit thanks to shell voicings. Basically, the perfect fifth is such a stable sound that if our chord is getting too complex, we can just leave it out and let it be implied by the structure. It's part of a 7th chord, but it's not part of that chord's essence. See, I'm bringing that back. You're learning things. But seriously, compare this to this. Still the same chord, right? That's the shell voicing for the major 7th, and we can do the same for the minor 7th and the dominant. And I'm on record as a major 7th chord hater. I do not like the way it sounds, and I think if you really must add another note to your major triad, you're usually better off with a major 6th. But as strongly held as that conviction is, do I think it's the worst possible 3-note chord? Not really. It's not that dissonant, and despite my vendetta, it's hard to deny that it's useful. A better candidate might be the shell voicing for the minor major 7 chord, which, sure, more dissonant and less familiar, but also strikingly beautiful in a haunting sort of way. Definitely not the worst. And the final easy ones are the suspended chords, which are like the consonant triads, but we replace the third with a neighboring note from the scale, either the perfect fourth or the major second. And these are obviously not the worst. They're really useful for pointing your ear toward the consonant triad they're replacing, which gives you a lovely way to play around with resolutions. As a trick, I like to use whichever suspension is closer to the target chord's third, so sus4s resolve to major, and sus2s to minor. But you can do whatever you want. They're great chords. Now let's get weird. Let's look at the exotic sus chords. Like, we did sus4, but why not sus sharp 4? It still kind of resolves to major if you're willing to be a bit generous. We can also do sus flat 2, which doesn't really resolve to minor, at least not to my ears, but you can kinda hear it if you really want. They're more dissonant and they're certainly less useful as sus chords. But that's the thing, they're not just that. These two chords belong to one of the most illustrious families in dissonance, the 016 trichord. The 016 trichord has its roots in musical set theory. This is a framework that tries to reduce every collection of notes in standard tuning down to as few categories as possible based on simple rules. Kinda like what we did at the beginning, but even more intense. They managed to get down to just 12 distinct 3-note sets. And the rules go like this. If you can get from one chord to the other by shifting all the notes up and down in octaves, they're the same thing. If you can get from one chord to the other by moving all the notes the same direction by the same interval, they're the same thing. If you can get from one chord to the other by turning it upside down, they're kinda the same thing. Roots don't matter, voicings don't matter, register, and even specific pitches don't matter. All that matters is if you can smoothly transform one into the other using these rules. It's extremely overkill for a lot of traditional harmony, but it's useful for some of the more esoteric stuff music theorists have to deal with sometimes. The 016 trichord, for instance, is also known as the Viennese trichord because of its popularity with the Second Viennese School, a group of composers who pioneered the atonal practice of 12-tone serialism in the early 20th century, and who we have not shut up about since. By convention, we name each family of related chords based on the arrangement of notes that lets us use the lowest numbers, measured in half steps. So 016 means we have some pitch, 0, and the notes 1 half step away, and then 6 half steps, or a tritone away. Unlike set theorists, though, we do care about the root, which makes working this out a little more complicated. Fortunately, the tritone does us a favor. It's symmetrical, so going up a tritone is the same as going down a tritone. This means we have to worry less about the upside down condition, so all 6 options have a similar flavor. All we need to consider is where the half step goes. So like the sus sharp 4 chord has it above the top note of the tritone, but we can also put it right below the top note, above the bottom note, or below the bottom note, which, to keep the same root, I'm voicing as a major 7th above. Same pitch, though. Each of these 4 chords has its root inside the tritone, but we can also use that extra floating pitch from the half step. If that's the root and it goes below its neighbor, we get that sus flat 2 thing, and if it's above, this. So are any of these the real worst chord? I mean, acoustically speaking, they're the most dissonant possible combinations of 3 notes. They use both the harshest intervals in standard tuning, so they're good candidates on that front. That extreme dissonance does make them useful, though. A lot of metal riffs rely on these chords, and there's something appealing about being literally the most dissonant thing. I mean, it's not unique. There are 6 of them, and maybe there's a case to be made for whichever member of the family is least dissonant, since that makes it the least interesting while still sounding nasty. For my money, I think that's the sus flat 2, but it feels against the spirit of the set to try to carve out one exception. They're all safe. This also brought up another interesting question. Inversions. If we use the same chord structure, but change which note counts as the root, then by our rules, we get a new chord. And we can apply that back to the ones we've already covered. Like, we said the major triad was good, but F major isn't the only major triad with F in it. It's also the 3rd of D flat major, and the 5th of B flat major. And going a step further, it's also in D minor, and B flat minor. What do we do with these? Well, my instinct is to just say they're still consonant triads, so of course they're still safe, but this game isn't fun if we don't play it by the rules, and the rules don't say we have a fixed bass. They say we have a fixed root, so somehow we have to understand these as F chords. what are they then? Let's start with the two first inversion chords, where the F would have been some kind of third. D minor is easy. These three notes form the shell voicing for my beloved major 6 chord. Gorgeous. D flat major's a little trickier. Instinctively, it feels like this is what F minor 6 should be, but traditionally, 6 chords use a major 6th no matter what quality their third is, so it's a little unusual. Still though, part of that is to avoid the dissonant rub against the 5th, and we don't have a 5th, so I'll call it an honorary 6th chord. Speaking of which, we should also quickly address the actual minor 6th shell voicing, which I'm not a huge fan of for kind of the same reason I don't like major 7th chords. It's meant to be an extension of a consonant triad, but it adds this weird, unpleasant dissonance that swamps out that consonant character. Probably not the worst, but not my favorite either. As for second inversion, where F is the 5th of the triad, these are, again, straightforward. They're what classical theorists call a 6-4 chord because they have a root, then the note's a perfect 4th, and some kind of 6th above it. Great name. That 6th could be major or minor, depending on the key, but they behave roughly the same way as a sort of double suspension. Classical harmony has some specific rules for when you're supposed to use these, but in 2 of the 3 most common cases, you play the 6-4 chord, then follow it up with a root position triad on the same note. In the auxiliary 6-4, it's a little decoration, typically on the 1, whereas in the cadential 6-4, it sets up the 5 chord. Both versions are lovely, they're very useful in certain contexts, and they're fun to think about. Great chords. A+. Wait, no, that's a different one. Anyway, this is taking longer than I thought it would, so let's speedrun the next section, shell voicing inversions. Same idea, but this time using our 7th chord shell voicings to generate new chords. Starting with first inversion again, D minor 7 makes a beautiful F chord, with a perfect 5th and a major 6th, kinda like a 6 chord without the 3rd. The first inversion major 7, on the other hand, is a lot worse, with this awkward half-step kind of floating in the middle of nowhere. Still, it does have a perfect 5th, so acoustically speaking, it can't be that bad, which brings me to the minor major 7, which is the same thing, but now there's no 5th to stabilize. It's just 2 different kinds of 6ths rubbing against each other, and since the minor major 7 isn't that common to begin with, being an inversion of it doesn't do much to clean things up. This is a good candidate, let's keep it in mind. And finally, we have the dominant 7, which is, again, dissonant, but now that dissonance has somewhere to go. I mean, it's D-flat 7, it can resolve to G-flat, but in this inversion, as an F chord, I hear it slightly differently. Having the B and D-flat right next to each other feels like it's begging my ears to fill in the gap, so what I really want it to do is resolve to C. Shell voicings don't have a 5th, so we can skip second inversion and go straight to third inversion, where the 7th of the chord is on the bottom. The third inversion, major 7, is kind of my favorite version of the major 7th chord. It really embraces the crunchiness that most of the others try to hide. On the other hand, the minor 7th becomes another sort of double suspension, surrounding the 3rd of the target chord with both the 4th and the 2nd for a really cool resolution. The minor major 7 is still kinda gross, although at this point it's approaching cluster chord territory where all the notes are so close together that you lose any real harmonic cohesion, which is interesting in its own right. And the dominant 7, once again, has that whole step tritone thing that's inviting you to fill in the gap. Which actually, let's look a little closer at that, because what we're seeing is that all the inversions of the dominant 7th chord belong to another interesting set theory family. Instead of O1-6, we're looking at the O2-6 trichord. This structure, with a tritone that needs to resolve and a whole step that gives it a direction, is a really interesting one, and again, because the tritone is symmetrical, it produces a reasonably small family that we can just consider as a group. We've already seen 3 of them, but there's still 3 more, the ones we get by flipping the dominant 7th chord upside down. I don't really know what to call these, but if we assume the whole step is always outlining the root of the target chord, we get this, this, and this, all of which are really interesting resolutions. I mentioned earlier that having a perfect 5th meant it probably wasn't going to be dissonant enough for our purposes, so let's take a second and get rid of the rest of those. There's only 2 chords left that have one over the root, this and this. They're both just 7th chords voiced without a 3rd, so we can call them power 7th chords if we want to sound cool, but the point is they're both fine. Not that interesting, but pretty inoffensive. But there's also some chords that have other perfect fifths hidden inside them. We can find most of the remaining ones by inverting our power sevenths. The second inversion gets us these add 11 chords, where the perfect fourths rub against the thirds. The minor one sounds great, and while the major one is a little crunchy, it's the good kind of crunchy, telling you something cool's about to happen. The third inversion minor 7 is a lovely little 6-2 chord, which can again resolve as a double suspension. The major version is again nastier, and that flat 2 doesn't really want to resolve up. What it really wants is to move to F, but since F is already in the voicing, it just kinda gets stuck. Not a great chord, and probably my pick for worst chord that technically contains a perfect fifth, but it feels tantalizingly interesting to play with if I could just figure out how to use it. Which leaves us with one final perfect fifth chord to address, and this leads into another whole family, the non-tertian chords. Tertian is a fancy word for 3, so tertian harmony is when the chord is built by stacking thirds. We veered off that pretty early in the video, so technically we've been non-tertian for most of this, but more specifically, it describes when the chord is made by stacking some other interval instead. The most famous of these are the chordal chords, built by stacking fourths, and the quintal chords from stacking fifths. That quintal chord is actually just another voicing of the sus2 chord, but the chordal one is something new. In chord symbol terms, we could call it F7 sus4, but that misses the point of its construction. It's two perfect fourths on top of each other, and if we weren't limited to 3 notes, we could keep that going for some really exciting chords. This is where that no voicings thing kinda fails us, because in this case the voicing is kinda the point. You really want to hear that stacking effect after all. But still, even without it, this remains a lovely chord. And there's some other non-tertian options as well. Secundal chords are stacks of seconds, and while these definitely want more than 3 notes, we can see the beginnings of them here. That could be 2 minor seconds, 2 major seconds, minor then major, or my personal favorite, major then minor. The major-only version sounds lovely and open, which makes sense since it's basically a major add 9. The others are all different flavors of crunchy, and that minor-only one is the beginning of a real cluster chord, but they all work in their own way. I don't know of a name for stacks of sixths, but they're not that important here. They're basically just inverted thirds, so they produce many of the same chords. 2 minor sixths just gives us an alternate voicing of the augmented triad, and combining a minor with a major gets us one of those 6-4 chords we talked about earlier. The only one we haven't seen is 2 major sixths, which is kinda like a shell voicing of the diminished 7th chord, in that it's probably the best way to evoke it with just 3 notes. Normally a shell voicing needs the 3rd and 7th, but in the diminished chord the 5th is actually really important because it's not perfect, and this lets you see that. I love the diminished 7th, so of course I like this chord. That leaves us with septimal chords, or stacks of sevenths. These look a lot like the secundal chords, but upside down. All major sevenths gives us, like, the opposite of a cluster, which feels weirdly incomplete, like it's not dissonant enough for what it is. All minor sevenths gives us this, which is surprisingly worse somehow. Major then minor is actually kinda lovely, and minor then major sounds okay spread out like this, but if we close the voicing into a single octave, that floating half-step thing gets kinda gross. There's a massive gap between the root and the major sixth that leaves it feeling both empty and jagged at the same time. It's bizarre. They also bring up another group that I don't really have a good name for, but I do want to address. The 2-7 chords. Like, we did stacks of sevenths and stacks of seconds, but what about a chord that uses one of each of them? Are those good? What do they do? And I'll be honest, I don't really know much about them. I don't think they're a common thing in any tradition that I'm aware of, but I'll do my best. Sevenths are just upside down seconds after all, so these are kinda like inverted versions of the secundal chords. Are we allowed to invert those? I don't know, we're gonna do it. And they do follow roughly the same pattern as the secundal chords. 2 major seconds was the best sounding one of those, and here a major second and a minor seventh does the same thing. Again, perfectly lovely chord, like a shell voicing of a minor 7 sus2, open, hollow, with a ton of evocative potential that's left to the listener's imagination. The others are less good. Swapping in a major 7th is more dissonant for the obvious reason, but I also think there's another more subtle thing going on. Again, to my ears at least, the sus2 implies a resolution specifically to the minor third, which means this chord naturally leads back to a minor major 7. Yikes. Of course, you can fix that with context, but we're 50 chords in, I'm not going to start considering context now. The remaining 2 chords both use a minor second with either a major 7th or a minor one. The major 7 version is like an inverted cluster chord, and it gets some of that same harmonic decohesion. The minor 7 version is... okay, I can't really explain it, but when I hear this, I really want it to resolve to some sort of F-sharp chord. Going straight to a consonant one is too jarring, but maybe it resolves to, like, F-sharp augmented? I like the sound of that. I don't know why. It just feels right. And that leaves us with just 3 options left. The first of these is one that I just didn't have anywhere else to put, the split chord. This is a chord with both a major and a minor third. Typically, these are voiced in different octaves, but even if we jam them right next to each other, we still get a fun little crunch. This sound is the basis for a lot of cool blues harmonies, including the Hendrix chord. So yeah, no problems here. And the last 2 are... I mean, they're weird. I couldn't really fit them into a category. There's one with a major 6 and a flat 2, which I can't think of any particular use for, and another with a minor 6 and major 7th, which actually has a satisfying resolution to a power chord, if you wanted to do that for some reason. And that's it. I don't know how long it took, but we got all of them. So now it's time for the final answer. Of these 55 chords, which one is the worst? Which one is the perfect blend of unpleasant, unhelpful, and uninteresting? If you're a regular viewer, and let's be honest, anyone who watched over 20 minutes of this nonsense definitely is, but if so, you're probably expecting me to say that there is no worst chord. I'm a big believer in subjectivity, after all, and these harmonic objects exist within contexts. Every one has its uses, and every one is interesting in its own right. Those are all very reasonable arguments, and I can certainly understand why you'd think I'd make them, but you're wrong. The worst chord is this one. And as always, thanks for watching. Thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewitt, Damian Fuller-Sutherland, Neil Moore, Jeff, and Michael Mole. Check out Patreon or Nebula for a fuller outro, and as always, keep on rockin'.